Hello, Internet. I am Pastor Recoil, and welcome to my parish. Today is Christmas Eve, and we're going to talk about it. Welcome to Pastor Recoil's parish, where I talk about some things in the Bible that you may not have heard about in church, either because it's not quite appropriate for all audiences, or it just isn't something that's easy to talk about in a sermon. Today's readings for Christmas Eve are Isaiah 9, 2-7, Psalm 96, Titus 2, 11-14, and Luke 2, 1-20. Even if you're not all that religious, our very Christianized culture means you're probably at least vaguely aware of what happened on Christmas Day. There's a mom and a dad, a baby born in a cave and laid in a manger, angels, and some shepherds. Oh, and of course, the baby never cried and was super holy and perfect and blah da blah da blah da blah da blah. The problem is that story cuts out a lot of information that we have from the Christmas account in Luke's gospel. And it makes it something that's a lot more sanitized. It takes away a lot of the humanness and turns an already fantastical series of events into something not at all realistic. So let's start by quickly looking at the supporting texts for today before diving right into Luke's Gospel's story of Jesus' birth. The reading from Isaiah 9 is a promise from God to a people who are living under the threat of an Assyrian invasion. God's people were looking everywhere but God for help. And yet God, through the prophet Isaiah, says, "A child will be born who will rule with justice and righteousness." Christians typically hear this passage and go, "Oh, well, it's talking about the birth of Jesus so many years in the future." But the people of Isaiah's day who were hearing this would think of someone else, someone who was born shortly after this prophecy was made, a guy named Hezekiah, who was the son of the king who was ruling, and who the Hebrew scriptures say was a king who ruled with justice and righteousness. King Hezekiah followed God even better than his ancestors did, and even says that King Hezekiah was more closely following God than any of the other kings of God's people. The other two readings are pretty straightforward. Psalm 96 celebrates the things that God has done and the things God is yet to do. Namely, that God saves God's people from injustice and violence, both now, in the past, and in the future. Titus 2 reminds us of what Jesus came to earth to do, giving himself for us and saving us from everything that is not of God, to do the things that God calls us to do, which, if you've been paying attention to the last couple of weeks, is working out God's justice in the world and using our resources to help those that don't have the resources that we have. So now we're back at Luke chapter 2. And in this account, we follow a couple, Joseph and Mary, as they travel back to Joseph's family's home in Bethlehem. This is for a bit of an odd event. There's a Roman Empire-wide census that we don't have any evidence for, and really, when you think about it, doesn't make a lot of sense. When we have a census in our country, we don't have to go back to where we were born or go back to where our family lived to fill out that census paperwork. No, the census comes to us. And so why would Joseph have to go from where he lived in Nazareth to his family's ancestral home of Bethlehem? That's a bigger discussion than I really want to get into in this video though. So at this point, we'll just continue on with the story. And at this point, Mary is very pregnant. She's pregnant with the child that God's messenger announced that she would bear. And even this is quite an odd situation. Mary isn't exactly married to Joseph. Now, the engagement that they had was not quite the same as the engagements that we have today. There would have been engagement contracts involved, and it was a lot more formal than what we would consider an engagement. But importantly, they weren't married. And there was also some scandal around Mary's pregnancy because Joseph had nothing to do with it. See, this scandal persists even into Jesus's adulthood. His opponents will question his parentage. And there are some popular counter-arguments to the virgin birth narrative involving a Roman soldier named Pantera and, let's say, a liaison of questionable consent for the sake of this YouTube video. And these aren't modern arguments looking backwards. These are arguments that spring up really early, all things considered, and would have been circulating around the same time that the Gospels were. So Mary and Joseph get to town and they do what everyone at that time would do. They look to stay with family. But in the context of the story, because of the census, Joseph's whole family was already there. So there wasn't any room for them in any of the family's guest rooms. And there especially wasn't room for this scandalous pregnant girl who might bring shame to Joseph's whole family. Of course, this is a proud family. This is a family descended from King David, after all. But even with all of that, family is family, and the rules of hospitality are the rules of hospitality, so Joseph and Mary sleep in the first century equivalent of the garage. A room that's in the house, but not really part of the house, and filled with animals. And so that is where Joseph and Mary are staying, and that is where Mary gives birth to her son Jesus, laying him in a manger, a feeding trough, because that's what they had. Now, at the same time, there were some shepherds that were out tending their sheep, and they get terrified by another messenger from God, announcing that the Messiah, potentially this fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecy, was born nearby. And if they want to see him, they should leg it to Jerusalem, or leg it to Bethlehem rather, and see this child that has been born. So they do. They head to Bethlehem. They find the house and they see Mary, Joseph, and Jesus, who was laying in the feeding trough, just like the angel said. Now, this is the same Christmas story that Linus reads in the Charlie Brown Christmas. It's the same one that's told in every nativity scene. But it always strikes me just how, well, trashy it is. God's Son, the Word of God made flesh, sounds like he would star in a bad TLC reality show. He is almost literally born in a barn to parents who we'll find out later in Luke's gospel are incredibly poor, and the only witnesses of his birth are some shepherds who had just come in from the field. Of all the ways that God could have entered the world, why would God choose something so messy? But I think that question is the point. Luke's gospel especially is all about this idea that we call the Great Reversal. The work of Jesus in the world is to turn the world upside down. The poor will be rich and the rich will be poor. The hungry will be fed and the fed will go hungry. The powerful will lose their power and the powerless will gain power. The oppressed will be freed and the oppressors will lose their privileged status. Jesus is good news for the people the world considers trash and bad news for the people the world considers important. And so even in this account of Jesus' birth, we see that good news that Luke is so trying to emphasize. It isn't a king who hears about the birth of Jesus, or foreign astrologers who have traveled a long way like we read in Matthew's gospel. There isn't some beautiful theological treatise on who exactly Jesus is, like we get in John's gospel. Instead, Luke's story of Jesus' birth is humble. It's trashy. It's even a little scandalous. And that's a good thing, because it reminds us that even though Jesus could have been born to whatever family God wanted, the Son of God chose to grow up, the son of a poor carpenter in an oppressed land, dealing with rumors of his mother's infidelity his whole life. Jesus' own birth story reminds God's people of how much God cares about those people, because he was one of them. So if you want to see more content like this, check out the links to my right, or click the logo just below my face to subscribe so you'll know when my next video comes out. Thank you for watching, and take the time this week to love your neighbor as yourself, especially if you don't like them all that much.